Focus. Focus. Ooh. Let's skip the ramble. My favourite books of 2017. First up, Fever Dream. This book was incredible. Well, I mean, obviously every single book I'm about to talk about is incredible considering it's my favourite books of the year, but whatever, it's incredible. So the author's from Argentina, so it was obviously translated into English. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize. I really wanted it to win, but sadly it did not. I still absolutely rave about this one though. It's, yeah, definitely deserves to be on the list of my favourite books, not only of the year, but of all time. I read this in one sitting. And that's not just because it's really, really short, it's because it's a mind-bending, page-turning, dreamlike, or nightmarish rather, type of story that I just needed to know what the hell was going on. And as soon as I finished it, I basically just wanted to find someone who'd read it so we could be like, what the fuck? It's psychological. It's brilliantly written, it will leave you thinking for a long time after it, and it's one that I definitely have intentions of reading again. I do also really recommend reading it in one sitting. I think it's really suited to that, but I also think it's really suited to a reread because I think that when I do reread it eventually, I feel like I'll get so much more from it. But yeah, I do really recommend this one if you have not read it. Solar Bones. So this one I remember when it first came out, it was in a sort of larger format, paperback edition. I kind of noticed it but it didn't appeal to me that much, and then it came out in this edition and I was suddenly more interested in it. It won a couple of prizes, and then I think whenever it got longlisted for the Man Booker Prize it drew my attention to it again, and then finally I heard that the entire book was one sentence, and in that moment I pretty much instantly bought it. Like as soon as I heard that, I literally bought it there and then. So yeah, it's one sentence. There's no punctuation. For some people that's an instant turn off, either because they think, oh, it's going to be too hard to read, or they're going to think, oh, what kind of pretentious experimental nonsense is this? But pretentious experimental nonsense is totally my bag. No shame. So yes, I picked this book up purely because it has one sentence, but the book ended up being so much more than that. It lets you into the internal world of a man who's pondering and looking back over his life. He's an engineer, and this is used thematically throughout the book to kind of explore ideas of building and rebuilding. It's thought-provoking, it's subtle, and it's just generally really, really well written. And I still felt like without the punctuation it was actually quite easy to read. You kind of got into the flow of it and it still felt like there were breaks. But yeah, this one is just, it was such a pleasant surprise because not only did I get the kind of experimental appreciation of the way that the narrative is, I also got the kind of internal world aspect of a human being, which is something that I really love whenever that's done in fiction. So yes, I very much enjoyed this one. Sarah Winman's Tin Man. So this is obviously not the final edition, this is actually a proof copy. It's only in hardback at the minute, but I actually really like the fact that this is a book with just a yellow cover. Beautiful sadness, guys. Beautiful sadness. My favourite phrase of all time. This is heart-wrenchingly brilliant. This is a book that succeeds in its sort of pensive and introspective writing. It's a book that explores relationships between these characters, the characterisation, the setting, the story, everything was just masterful. Sarah Winman's books, when I look at them, they don't appeal to me at all. They're not the kind of thing that I would ever pick up, and the only reason I ever did is because I was recommended to. And yeah, so when I look at them, they don't appeal to me, but every time I've read anything by her, I've completely fallen in love with it. I find it quite difficult to kind of emphasise what's so good about Tin Man because it's sort of understated, and it's hard to get people to read it because for me it's the reading experience that made me fall in love with it. It's kind of like when you have a dream and you tell someone else that dream, so you can tell them the story of what happened and you can maybe portray some of the feelings, but you can never really emulate the tone. And that's what I struggle with whenever I talk about this one, because it's the tone. The tone is just incredible, and this is a book I just think that you have to experience for yourself, but it is a definite favourite of mine, the Gustav Sonata. Sadly, I do not own this one. That's something I definitely need to rectify. It's one that I borrowed, but I definitely want to get my own copy because I did really love it and I would quite like to read it again as well. I talked about this one in my video where I was looking at the best sort of fiction paperbacks of 2017 according to the sort of general population. So I'll link that video for you to check out if you're interested. But this one, basically everything I just said about the Tin Man, apply that to the Gustav Sonata. I feel exactly the same about both books. This one's set in Switzerland over a number of years. Again, it's a kind of an exploration of relationships between people. The setting also offers a glimpse into the effects of war in Switzerland, so that was kind of interesting. It's a novel that has a lot of depth and it's quietly brilliant. I say that about the Tin Man as well. They both have a lot of depth and they both are quietly brilliant. Autumn. Obviously this is one of my favourite books of 2017. This is part of the quartet that Ali Smith is doing of the season, so this is obviously Autumn and this was the first one that came out. I love the themes, I love the writing style. It's set in the UK during the Brexit shenanigans, but that's not really the main focus. There's a lot going on in this book. It looks at art, it looks at the impacts of politics, it looks at loss and division. The book's all over the place, to be honest, but I mean that in the most complimentary way. If you're the kind of person that likes books that are really heavily plot driven, you probably wouldn't like this because it is definitely more about sort of poetic writing and themes and exploring different ideas, and I love that in a book, so I definitely really loved this one, and for me it was honestly a true sensation. The Arrival. This is one that I sadly don't own either. I definitely need to pick it up at some point. It's one that I hadn't heard of whenever I read it. I just picked it off the shelf, so I had no preconceived notion of what I was getting into, and then it's ended up being probably, actually, do you know what? It's probably my favourite graphic novel I have ever read. It was incredible, absolutely incredible. It's also a silent graphic novel, so there's no words, and the story is just told through the imagery, but it's done so well. It looks at this guy who leaves his family to move away and get a job, and sort of is kind of about how he's trying to get a better life, and it perfectly illustrates what it's like to move from one place to another. It shows just how alien that can be, and it does that through magical realism. The illustrations are incredible. It managed to invoke so much emotion in me, and I just think that it perfectly conveys what it's like to be an immigrant. This one I really do recommend if you have any interest in graphic novels, and the style of the illustrations as well is something that I really enjoyed. Alone in Berlin. This is one of the first books that I read this year, but it's definitely stayed with me since then. I remember I had this for ages and I just looked at it and I thought it's going to be really dull, it's going to be really depressing, and just, yeah, it just took me a long time before I picked this one up. But whenever I did read it, I thought it was incredible. It was thrilling, it was a page turner, I felt like I could really sink my teeth into it. It's set in Berlin during the war, and it tells the story of a couple who start leaving these anti-Hitler postcards around. And even though that may seem like such a small thing, it kind of explores how this was such a big deal at that time, and it's a very compelling story, and I just think that it's written really well, and I did really find it hard to put down. It's just a absolutely incredible plot, which is kind of nice because everything I've talked about so far is more focused on sort of theme and good characterization and that kind of thing. This is very much more plot driven, and I kind of enjoy a mix of those two things anyway, so it's nice to have some books that are a bit more sort of on themes, and this is one that is definitely more on story. It's also based on a couple who did actually do this, so that was really interesting to learn that as well. Brilliantly written, really good story, massive page turner, thrilling, and just, yeah, it's definitely another one that's probably going to be a favourite for a long time. Sapiens. I feel like I read this ages ago, but yeah, I did read this in 2017, and it's one of the best non-fiction books I have ever read. So this one does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a brief history of humankind. It's a fascinating journey through so many different aspects of humanity, and it kind of just reminds you of how shit we all are, which is something that I always appreciate because it's true. It's a really accessible read, and I have mentioned on here before that if you're a person that doesn't read that much non-fiction but you want to, I do really recommend this one because it is really accessible, it is really easy to read, and there's a good mix of stuff in there that you're bound to find at least one part of it interesting, and you can always skip through the parts that maybe you don't find so interesting. Personally, I found the majority of it pretty fucking interesting. It looks at biology, it looks at culture, it looks at agriculture, it looks at religion, it looks at a whole range of topics all related to the history of humankind. It's a book that offers new perspectives, it will make you think, and I think that it's a good book to start with if you're becoming sort of interested in humankind and its history. I think that it's a good basic place to start. Annihilation. So this is part of a trilogy. This is the first one. I actually read the first two in the trilogy this year and I have the third one to read. This is one of the most unique kind of science fiction books that I have ever read. I feel like it's very different to the vast majority. It's about Area X and a number of different groups have been sent there to explore this Area X. One group came back and they all developed cancer, another group came back and they all committed suicide, and this book focuses on a group that gets sent there and they're all women. So it's 4 women. You've got a biologist, an anthropologist, a surveyor and a psychologist, and it's kind of about their exploration of this strange Area X. So the group itself I found particularly interesting in that they're all women and they all had these sort of different professions. It's a book that alters your mind. It's bizarre, it's weird, it's strange, it's atmospheric, and it feels very, very original. It's also quite literary, which I always really appreciate because that's something that you don't always get with science fiction, and I'm really looking forward to reading the third one in the trilogy as well. The Divided Self. So another non-fiction one. I also read this during non-fiction November and I really, really enjoyed it. Obviously, it's on my favourite books list. This is a book that looks at the experience of schizophrenia in a really compassionate way, and it made me see how the majority of the population, and I include myself in this, we just really have no idea about things like this. You think you know, but no you don't. So I found this a really interesting read, and it definitely sort of shifted my perspective a bit, which is something that I really love about reading. I love whenever my perspective or my view on things slightly changes, and this is a book that definitely had that effect. If you want to know more of my thoughts on this, in which I kind of explore the case studies a little bit more, I will link that video for you to check out if you are interested. But yeah, this is a book that looks at schizophrenia. It has case studies as well as theory, which really sort of breaks it up and helps you to understand it. It's one that you definitely have to concentrate on, but I think that it's a really fascinating insight into this type of mental illness, and it's one that I definitely think that if you have any interest in mental health, it's one that I really do recommend. At the time of recording this, it's not quite the end of the year, but I have read a total of 102 books at this point in time. I think that'll probably increase to about 107. So obviously it was quite hard to narrow this down to 10 books, but those were the favourite books that I could come up with. I also find it interesting just to look back at what I have read. The majority of what I read this year was fiction, so I haven't got a rounded number to tell you how many fiction books, but I've got some stats for sort of the rest of what I read. In 2017, I read 21 non-fiction books. I read 8 YA/children's books, thank you Harry Potter and his Dark Materials. I read 6 fantasy books. I read 3 science fiction books, which is absolutely fucking diabolical. There's been years in which I've read mostly science fiction to have only read 3. Like, I was so shocked whenever I realised that. I can't believe it. It's something that I need to rectify. I think it's because whenever I did my dissertation a few years ago, science fiction was a huge part of it. And I think since then I've really struggled to pick it up, but yeah, it's something that I definitely want to sort that out. I cannot believe I've only read 3. Another one that I'm horrified at is the fact that I've only read 2 poetry books this year, which is just terrible. I have poetry books to read, I don't know why, I just haven't picked them up. So again, that's something that I need to look at. I read 2 crime thriller books, which isn't really a surprise. They're not really the kind of thing that I pick up very often. I mean, it's something that I'm considering maybe exploring a little bit more, but it's not my sort of main interest in books. So yeah, I've only read 2 crime thrillers. I read 5 horror/gothic books. I read 15 graphic novels. I read 38 female authors, which at first I thought, oh, that's really good, but then I realised that's less than half, so that's something else I really want to change. I read 19 translated books, which isn't bad, but again, it's something that I want to increase. I've already put up a video looking at some of my goals for 2018, but I think having looked at these stats, I kind of want to add something to that, which is basically overall to read more diversely in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, and also to read a few more independent publishers as well. Anyway, there we have it. Those are my favourite books of 2017. I'd love to know if you've read them, what you think of them, if you hate them, if you love them, what was your favourite book or books of 2017. So yeah, let me know and I will see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.